Consider supporting Archaeo-Soup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Hello, Dr. Adam Daubney. Good morning.
Hello.
It's a pleasure to have you for a bit of a chat, because I came across a news story recently which just fascinated me, and you were the named archaeologist, so I'm holding you accountable. But I'm curious with this story, because it seems to be a relatively late surviving act of, I don't know, totemism in a barn. I mean, can you just walk us through what archaeological observation I'm talking about?
Yeah, so we're actually delving into the world of chess here. So very randomly, I had a chap email me to say, I've found 2 chess pieces in my barn. And immediately I thought, that's really interesting. Now, if somebody had said, I found 2 chess pieces in my garden, I'd probably think, yeah, that's not that interesting. But the fact that it was found in a barn is interesting. So I went over.
Well, presumably because people don't normally play chess in barns, I guess.
Well, it's not. Yeah, it's exactly where it was found in the barn that was really interesting.
Okay.
As he said, he was renovating a barn. Basically, he's got this sort of old barn that he's used for livestock. And his roof was leaking, and had been leaking for some time. So he got round to renovating it, and he took out a timber beam which went across the threshold, the doorway into the barn. And as he reached his hand in, it was all mushy wood in the timber. And he pulled the timber out, and as he did, in his hand were 2 chess pieces, that kind of size, decent sized chess pieces. Which, for all intents and purposes, looked like the Isle of Lewis chess pieces.
Yeah.
So he sent me some photos, and I thought, I need to go and see this. This is an interesting story here.
Okay. Now, I mean, there's an awful lot to unpack there. So the way you described it almost sounds like Howard Carter's, oh, what can you see? Wondrous things.
I see wonderful
things. But that discovery is quite interesting in so much as, first of all, it's over the entrance. It is that in that transition from presumably outside the barn to inside the barn, or certainly from one space to another. How did that impact what you came to understand of these pieces? I mean, and also actually, I mean, were they of 1,000 years ago? Were they actually potentially even linked to the Lewis chessmen?
So that email sparked off a whole long series of research questions, and I've never had to research chess pieces, so this is new territory for me. So when I first saw the pieces, I thought, man, these look like the Isle of Lewis pieces, which are these sort of medieval chess pieces. But when I actually got the piece in my hand, I realised that it was made of plaster of Paris. Now you think, well, that can't be very old.
No.
So a little bit more research, and apparently in the late 19th century, the craze was to collect chess sets which were based on much earlier sets, and they would take moulds of medieval chess pieces, cast them in plaster of Paris, and then play chess with them.
I see. Okay.
So we're able to establish that the chess pieces were actually, sort of very late 1800s, possibly even early 1900s.
Right.
So then you think, well, why would, as archaeologists, would we be interested in objects that are so recent? And 2 things came out which were fascinating. The first one is that these chess pieces are based on a medieval set which nobody can find. So although these are modern finds, they're preserving chess pieces from a much earlier time.
That's interesting. So, but also presumably there must have been accessible enough for someone to say, "Can we take a cast of your chess pieces, please?" and then mass produce that mold, or in some way make it available to someone to make a plaster of Paris version.
Yeah,
Interesting.
absolutely.
Okay, interesting.
And what we can see is that if you look on the Antiquities trade, people are selling these sort of early 19th century, mid 19th century chess pieces, which are exactly the same ones as ours. So you can still buy them.
Yeah.
Interestingly, if you go on popular internet auction sites, you can still buy modern casts of the exact same pieces that were discovered in this barn.
Right.
So they're obviously a very famous set, and most of the internet descriptions for these chess pieces say that they're cast from a medieval set that is now in Leipzig Museum.
Okay.
Now, I think there's a little bit of fake news floating around the internet here, because I've not been able to trace these. So I'm not sure how accurate that statement is. But nonetheless, these are based on medieval sets.
Okay. Now, this reminds me of my dad. Funnily enough, he molded his own chess set out of a form of resin, and unfortunately, they smelled really bad. They never fully cured, I think. So we have this carrier bag up in the attic of just manky chess pieces that are beautiful but just smell. But they're very much based on the Lewis chessmen. But it's interesting that was a craze that was happening in the mid 19th century. But then why would you put them into a door frame? What's the significance of that, do you think?
Yeah, now that's the question which unravels a whole interesting story, really. So the fact that they were found in a threshold immediately makes you think of these amuletic deposits, these sort of ritual and very intentional placing of objects on boundaries as a way of warding off evil spirits. And we see this time and time and time again across the rural landscape in particular. And we see it happening in domestic houses right the way through to public buildings, where people, as they're constructing these buildings, they carefully place things like mummified cats, old shoes, witch bottles with urine and nails and hair and all sorts of weird and wonderful things.
Biblical quotations, this kind of thing.
Yeah, and what they seem to be doing is placing them very intentionally in sort of access points to buildings. So, for example, doorways, fireplaces, chimneys, the loft, those sorts of places. And nobody really understands it thoroughly. But I think it's increasingly clear that people are doing this as a way of kind of warding off evil spirits.
Well, and presumably in that sense, a fireplace isn't a conventional access point, is it? So it must be someone either. And you're warding off.
Comes down the chimney.
Sorry? Oh, Santa.
Well, Santa comes down the chimney.
That's true, Santa does. But in that sense, it's not. As you say, this does lean towards the sort of the warding off of a spiritual or supernatural element. It's unlikely that you're going to be warding off a normal person through the chimney fireplace. That's really okay. Okay. Well, what about the specific pieces then? Which pieces were chosen for this purpose, and why?
And that's a great question, because I think it's when we look at which pieces were chosen, that really reinforces this idea of amuletic protection. So whoever hid them away, they chose the bishop, and the bishop is shown in like a sort of praying position. And they also chose the queen.
Okay.
And I think the queen is a substitute or representation of Mary. So essentially you've got really potent figures of the faith. You've got Mary and a bishop praying away and actively protecting the livestock and the household from sort of evil spirits.
Yeah, evil influence. Yeah. Okay. So this is interesting. This also interested me because this was the 1850s. This isn't, for example, a Tudor cottage where mummified cats might be found somewhere. This is a relatively late surviving instance of this sort of behaviour. Obviously in the 1850s we see things like the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, so on and so forth, and also we had been through the Enlightenment, so called, and that was having a huge effect on how people, broadly speaking, saw their place in the world, or certainly those conversations were starting to filter down to all levels of society. How do you think this behaviour in the 1850s, or how do you think that it reflects upon that time and all of these different influences on people's beliefs about the world? I suppose another way of putting that is to say, what do you think this behaviour tells us about real life in the 1850s? Do you think people were sort of holding onto a vestige of a sort of, as you say, amuletic, totemistic sort of behaviour, despite perhaps other influences coming through?
Yeah, absolutely. I think essentially what we're seeing is the humanness of humanity. People. Science was on the rise, and people were kind of understanding the world in ways that they'd never known before. But that still doesn't stop people worrying about everyday life, about getting ill, about getting sick. And even if you start to understand that the Earth is perhaps much older than previously thought, that's not going to help you when your son is sick or your daughter's ill. And so people naturally still retain aspects of faith that help them in their day-to-day journey. And we see it today. People throw coins into wells. Some people do it just purely out of tradition. Other people do it because they think it actually means something. Other people hammer coins into trees. Again, some people do it because everyone else is doing it. Other people doing it because they believe it will help them. So I think what we're seeing is this sort of blending of folklore tradition with dominant religion at the time, and also
and a prevailing hobby, it seems.
And a prevailing hobby. Everyone was doing it. But what's interesting is that when we look very closely at the types of objects, and when we take the big picture view, so not just this one particular set of chess pieces, when we look at the entire assemblage, we can start to see trends in deposition. So, for example, shoes are one of the most common things that people would hide away. And when we look at them, I think it's something like 90% plus of shoes which are deposited are worn. So these are very, objects which have actually been physically attached to the human body, and which perhaps would have attracted spirits in a more potent sort of way. And then when we look at the size of the shoes, we realise that almost every shoe that gets secreted away belongs to a child. So, or would have belonged to a child. So we then can start to ask further questions about and really drill into people's belief systems and what these sort of amulets were supposed to be doing.
Well, and also I suppose in that I'm reminded of every year in our household we watch Terry Pratchett's Hogfather at Christmas. And there is a reason for me mentioning this, but in that there's a very strong element through the story of the potency of things that we discard that were once part of us. So teeth, for example, fingernails and hair, and presumably a shoe is somewhat like that, in so much as whether perceived or imagined or just simply not wanting to run the risk, there is a potent connection to you having grown up to a certain point and now no longer perhaps needing that shoe, but you don't want to leave that in a cupboard because something could happen to it which might affect you in your personhood or in your body now, despite no longer being able to wear the shoe. Did you think that's an element of it? Do you think people are wanting not to just leave these potentially potent symbols around, or do you think actually maybe you don't even necessarily have to have had a child in the house to have a child's shoe? Do you think there's something else going on there? It's not necessarily that it was owned by an occupant of the house.
Yeah, they're fascinating questions, and I don't know how far we could answer them on the surviving evidence. It might be that some people who actually didn't have children still would have obtained a child's shoe because the child's shoe perhaps was more effective in warding off spirits than an adult shoe. We unfortunately we just can't get back to the real data to sort of verify that or not. But it's an interesting thought. I think the fact that these things, the shoes are all in a worn state. really strongly suggests that there is, like you say, there's this sort of inalienability, this inseparability between humans and the things that they wore. And that's what makes them so significant to a sort of anti-witchcraft amulet.
Yeah. Well, also, actually, I've just been reminded of something. I think in Tudor times, in the sort of the 16th century, 15th maybe, there was a belief that leather items that you wore could be affected by essentially fae and fairies, so belts and shoes and I think trousers as well. And it sounds weird, but they would be described as fluctuating in size. So the idea would be that if you found, and it may well be that someone's just simply put on weight, but if you found that your belt didn't fit you, that maybe you were being affected by the other world, by the spirits or by fairies. And so maybe there's an element there in terms of these are things. Often, I guess, shoes are made also from material that's come from another living creature as well. So leather goods in particular may well have had a sort of a certain association, perhaps. Interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to take away from these chess pieces is actually the reality that the spiritual world was far more important and intertwined in people's daily lives than we probably could ever perceive today. The spirit world was an everyday risk, an everyday threat, and you had to do whatever you could to protect your family. And remembering this is a time where you couldn't just nip down to the corner shop and buy some paracetamol.
And smallpox was a very real problem, and
absolutely. So the spirit world needed to be tamed. It needed to be put into order, and and you would do whatever kind of rituals necessary, and you would believe them, or at least they would bring comfort. I think.
Yeah, hedging your bets at the very least. Yeah. Okay, well, in the particular news story that I came across there was the you expressed your interest in trying to get other people to report and to be aware of, at the very least, the potential for these sorts of finds in building renovations and other projects that they may, even if they know someone who knows someone who's doing something. Because you're linked with Lincolnshire Council, but would you mind if people were to get in touch from other parts of the country and say, we found this, that, and the other in our attic or something? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. So the scheme that I work for is called the Portable Antiquities Scheme. And we're a national scheme, and we're here to record finds discovered by the public. And it doesn't matter whether those finds have come from the plough soil, whether they've come from walking a dog across a field, or whether they've come from somebody doing renovations to a building. I think these sort of anti-witchcraft amulets are far more common than we actually realise.
Yeah.
I think what has happened over the past is that people don't recognise them as things worthy of being reported. If I wasn't an archaeologist and I was sort of renovating my house and found a shoe in the loft, I would probably think, perhaps somebody just forgot to clear it out, when they sold the house, so many generations ago. I perhaps wouldn't make that link between it being ritually significant.
Yeah.
So I suppose what we'd say to the public is, anything that seems slightly out of the ordinary, we'd love to see it. There's never a stupid question that the public can ask when it comes to archaeology.
Yeah. Okay. We just briefly then, just for my own interest on that note. I know of buildings where maybe playing cards, or I think in one instance there was a billiard ball that had found its way somehow under the floor. Do you think it's worthwhile even bringing those things that may simply have just been a child playing to the attention of their local officer, or Portable Antiquities Scheme representative? Because there may well be aspects of that behaviour that connect to other things that you guys are aware of, that on its own just looks like a play incident or an accident, or someone, as you say, forgetting something. Do you think no matter how small, it's worthwhile just asking?
Absolutely, yeah. It's so important to report everything.
Yeah.
So we can look at it and make an assessment. I mean, your comments sort of brought to mind early Anglo-Saxon burial archaeology. So there have been so many excavations of 6th century burials up and down the country, and quite frequently excavators have discarded things like fossils which have turned up in graves, thinking that perhaps they're just part of the natural,
or like an intrusion, or
So I think it's natural, so we won't record that. But in fact, we now know that fossils were often used as amulets, and perhaps were purposely placed into the graves. So it's really important that we record all of this, even if we don't quite understand it. Who's to say that in 10 years, 20 years' time, somebody, some bright PhD student will come along and say, actually, all of those billiard balls, they're all part of this sort of, wider ritual tradition. And show us everything.
Excellent. Okay. Well, actually, we sort of come full circle in that sense. No, billiard ball pun not intentional there. In so much as the Saxons were great collectors of bits that they found in buildings, things like Roman coins and jewellery and stuff, and it would often end up in the grave with them. But also, can I leave you with an interesting factoid that I learned the other day about billiard balls?
Sure.
There was a point at which billiard balls were at risk of, or billiards was at risk of going out of business because they were so popular, and they were producing balls using ivory. And there was a great competition launched to try and replace the material, because they realised, not for conservation purposes, but they realised that there simply weren't enough elephants. It wasn't a case of, oh no, we may run out. It was just a case of, this material is finite. So they asked the public, how can we make a better billiard ball, or a sustainable billiard ball, I guess you might say, using today's language. And that's how the material celluloid was produced. It came to the attention of the people running the competition. They started to make celluloid billiard balls, and that's the reason why eventually film stock used celluloid, because it became a commonly made material. And here we are, sort of on a digital version of that. It's interesting how as you say, bring things to people's attention, and you're bound to learn something. And in the case of billiard balls, it's an interesting little factoid. There you go. You can have that for free.
I never knew that. I'll take that away and ponder it.
You're welcome. But thank you very much for your time this morning. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure.
And if there's any additional information that comes up about this find, would you let us know? We might have a bit more of a chat. And
sure, absolutely, love to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Cheers.